Hello, I'm Ted Porter, Ted Trussell Porter. I was born in New Albany in March of 1959. My father's family was from New Albany, and my mother moved here from Ackerman, Mississippi, a smaller town south of here. I grew up with a very large Porter slash Hall family in town. And at the time, my father's family had a lumber company, and I would go down there and play in the loft that had all these building materials. And I think that's one of the kind of three or four main influences that led me to eventually become an architect. Some of the others are I know when I was very young, my parents commissioned an architect who was a childhood friend of my mother's to build a house here in New Albany. His name was Darnell Fulgham, and he was also from Ackerman, Mississippi, but he had been away to school on the GI Bill in the Pacific Northwest and came back to Mississippi with some very contemporary ideas and design directions. And so the house he built for my parents was a little, forward thinking, especially in the 1960s. And I think that influenced me a lot. It had very interesting interplay of spaces and forms, and I've always been interested in that. And in kind of layman's terms, what that means is, one room overlooking another, or a balcony from a second floor overlooking a first floor, or a high ceiling that connects two different rooms, things like that. So I think that influenced me. Also, I went this morning to check at the Union County Library. They still have a book, a Frank Lloyd Wright book from the 1950s that I last checked out in 1974 with my signature on the card catalog. And I remember as a child enjoying going to what was then the Jenny Stephen Smith Library and looking at both their modern architecture books. At that time, Frank Lloyd Wright would have been considered a modern architect that long ago, as well as their historical books. I was always interested in the kind of antebellum Southern architecture, that grand houses. So that was influential. In terms of schooling, everyone always says, "Oh, well, I would have been someone would have been an architect, but they weren't good in math." Architecture is really not that much about math. That said, one of my great teachers was Mrs. Golding, who taught geometry, and I've always been interested in geometry. And also, in addition to my normal courses, I took a mechanical drawing class in high school as an elective. And that was very good, just in terms of learning how to draw carefully and precisely with pencils and T-squares and triangles and things like that. So I finished high school at what was then W.P. Daniel High School in New Albany in 1977 and went to Mississippi State University. And the architecture program then was fairly new. It just celebrated its 50th anniversary. And it was incredibly energetic and had a lot of vitality, and architecture professors from around the country had come there to teach. And they also brought in a lot of visiting architects from around the country and around the world. And it was a very interesting time. And I stayed there and worked very hard for 4 years, and then left there with a bachelor's degree and went to graduate school. And I went to Yale in New Haven, Connecticut for a 3-year master's degree. And while I was there, that was interesting because even more so than Mississippi State, they brought in architects from around the world. I had some very good professors, an Englishman named Jim Sterling, the dean of the school, who was Caesar Pelli, different people, Robert Stern, architects who are now in their 90s, if they're still alive, who are fairly well known. And after 3 years there, during that 3-year time, because New Haven is only about an hour and a half from New York by train, Amtrak, well, Metro North, it's easy to get to and from, and a lot of students would go on weekends or for holidays or whatever to New York. So I became very familiar with New York then. I had always wanted to live in New York. So when I graduated from school, um, I had a job offer to stay in Connecticut, in New Haven, and work for Caesar Pelli for his firm. And I had a job offer from I.M. Pei, who was a New York architect. And at the time, he was doing the Louvre addition in Paris, the renovation of the Louvre, and he was doing a project for the JFK airport. So I chose to go to New York and work for him. And I remember frankly, the salary offer for New York was just a little bit more than the salary offer for New Haven. And Caesar Pelli in New Haven said in his deep Argentine Spanish accent, "Well, Ted, you know you can live for a lot cheaper in New Haven than you can in New York." But I chose New York anyway. And that was in the summer of 1984, and I've been there ever since. So I worked, I was at I.M. Pei's office, and at the time they had about, I don't know, more than 100 people. And you did everything on paper with pens, and you actually did, the drawings were done on a plastic vellum type material. And then if your ink bled over a line, you took a little razor blade and scratched it off to make everything perfect. And I did that for 3 years. This was long before the age of computers. In fact, I remember actually at Yale, there was one big computer at the architecture school that only one student knew how to use. He was like an early adapter of technology. And over a 24-hour period, it could print out one drawing maybe. And the same was true at I.M. Pei's office. They were very savvy to get into computers early on, but they had a whole floor of a building filled with this enormous mainframe kind of computer, and it would draw very slowly, but the rest of us just did ink drawings. And I say that by way of contrast. Today, there are people in my office who on a laptop can practically draw a whole city in an afternoon, and using AI and cobbling images from the internet and things like that. But anyway, so I worked at Pei, and that was good experience, but I liked the idea of doing smaller projects and doing things on my own. So I went out on my own after I got licensed. The process for being licensed is you have to work at least 3 years, and then you take an exam, a 2-day exam back then. I passed that, fortunately, and got a license so I could work on my own. So I did that for a while. I had partners, a whole process of the last 4 decades, different iterations of working with people. For the last 8 years, it's been Ted Porter Architecture, PLLC. I've done a lot of different kinds of projects, but mostly residential in and around New York City. In the city, I don't do skyscrapers or things like that. I do mostly renovations of existing buildings. Outside the city, it's more freestanding houses. We've done some art galleries. We've done some art-related work. But it's mostly houses. I like doing domestic architecture. Yesterday I heard at church here in New Albany a sermon where the minister said there was some question about the translation in the Bible of whether or not in heaven, our Father, whether there are many mansions or many rooms. And I like to think of it as there are many mansions for everyone. That's M-I-N-I, that everybody gets some. My idea of heaven is everyone gets a great little space that's beautifully designed, very functional, very appropriate for them, but very elevating of the spirit. And that's what I like to think of as domestic architecture. It's not just giving you a place to shelter against rain and heat and cold, but it also helps you live better and elevates your spirit. And that's a lot of what I try to do in my work, or I've tried to do over the years. When I was in junior high school and high school, we had a band and had various names. And uh, my other three primary band members are still in New Albany: Paul Tate, Ray Collins, and David Gaines. And sometimes David Ellis was a part of the group. But that was a lot of fun. And I think they still perform together. I know they do still from time to time. Well, one thing I just about New Albany itself, I enjoy coming back here because I think the town has done a great job of developing its sense of place and its downtown as a place to attract people and where people even live. I'm very happy that my mother lives in an apartment in the downtown with the address of Main Street. But it's great for me when I visit because I can just walk around everywhere. It's like a miniature New York with some restaurants to go to, and I can walk up to the coffee shop. This morning, the weather was nice enough that I took the Tanglefoot Trail, a mile and a half or 2 miles south of town, and turned around and walked back and passed half a dozen people who were doing the same thing. Um, so it's if I could build, excuse me, there. I'm always looking at empty lots or lots with buildings that could be repurposed in downtown New Albany and imagining what could go there, the kind of either residential work apartments or offices or restaurants or institutions or whatever. Because I think to keep a dense downtown is really important. And I think New Albany, unlike a lot of other small towns around America, New Albany has been very successful at keeping its downtown or making its downtown lively and interesting and attractive. Okay, one of the things I would add is I've been working on a restaurant design for downtown for someone, and that would be a great building to get built with a restaurant on the ground floor and some apartments above it. Um, a thing that I think would be great in the downtown is some kind of assisted living development that maybe had 16 or 20 units that was right in the downtown so that even if people weren't mobile, got to a point where they weren't mobile, they could still see what's going on out their windows and have some visual connection to the downtown. And if they were still mobile, or even if they were required to be in wheelchairs, they could be connected to the downtown. And I think that would be interesting. And, our population is getting older. I know it from my own family. So it'd be nice to have a place like that. Each of the respective colleges at MSU honors an alumnus or alumna with an award each year for alumnus of the year. And when I finished Mississippi State, I got all engaged in, moving up north and being in school there and living in New York. And then over the last 20 or 30 years, I've gotten more excited about being re-engaged with the students at Mississippi State in the architecture program. And I've been down there a lot to be on reviews of student projects. And I'm on the alumni advisory board for the school. And I also, I like travel. I think it's really important, especially for architects, to go see other buildings and see them in person around the world, around the country, around the world. And because while it's interesting to look at works in photographs or in drawings, there's nothing like actually experiencing the outside and the inside of a building. So I give a travel scholarship to a student each year at MSU, chosen by the faculty. And with the caveat that they have to go outside of the United States. They can go anywhere in this hemisphere or anywhere else, but they can't just go to Memphis to see architecture and get the scholarship. They need to travel a little farther afield and maybe see a little bit of the world while they're doing that. When you study architectural history, and this is a long conversation to get into, but when I was in school, there was a real stress on architectural history, and it had kind of come back into popularity in the architectural world. I say that it had come back because previous to that, there had been this emphasis on new, everything being new and without any, um, influences. And in the late 60s and then through the 70s and into the 80s, there was an interest in architectural history. So I had this great professor at MSU named Michael Fazio, who was from Alabama originally, but I think his architectural history degree was from Cornell. And he was just great at starting with the Italian Renaissance and going through to modern architecture. And it was a very good grounding in, what was important in each period and for each style, and what were the what's the word I'm looking for? What were the influences, be they climate or society or religion or wars, whatever, that made architecture the way it was. And so with the Italian Renaissance, it was, as the name would imply, it was looking a rebirth of ancient Greek and Roman models. Then there was Baroque, which was just, a kind of over-the-top iteration of Renaissance. Then there were reactions to that. There were also things such as, a lot of people like the idea that churches are Gothic style. Well, that was both from the Gothic period, but also a revival of that style. Going into, in the 19th century, there was an emphasis on how buildings were actually built and all the new materials that were developed in the industrial age. So steel, concrete, concrete had been used by the Romans, but new concrete forms, glass became available in large sheets. So a lot of the architecture that we have today is just directly a result of all these industrial processes that weren't available before that. And so from each of those different periods, and there are numerous little sub-periods, they're great works of architecture that represent all of those things coming together. The Italian Catholic Church was predominant until the Reformation, and with that, there were all kinds of reactions to the kind of architecture that had been built up until the 1500s, and then the Catholic Church itself had to renew with its a kind of new enthusiastic style to attract people, as well as the Protestant churches. So, and those, I cite those because, as all of us know, in any community, often the churches are the biggest, most important buildings, public buildings. Those and the courthouses and city halls. And so, for instance, New Albany, Union County's courthouse is a big, you'd call it and I mean this as a compliment, a big Palladian pile. It's a little bit influenced by Palladio from the 1500s in northern Italy, in the Veneto. And it's got a dome in the same way that the US Capitol has a dome. And all those domes come from places like St. Peter's in Rome, or from Wren's St. Paul's in London, where church architecture suddenly influences political architecture. And his name is Louis Kahn, K-A-H-N. And one of the reasons I'm partial to him is because Yale has two very important buildings by him: the Yale Art Gallery, which is an early work, and then the British Art Center, which is basically his last work. But he just did these amazing things, and I think the further we get away from him, he died in the 1970s, the greater he's considered as just really the best 20th century architect. And he did buildings, I'm trying to think of something that would be generally known. There's a great museum in Texas, the Kimball Art Gallery, that he did. There's once again, the Yale Center for British Art that he did. He didn't do any buildings in DC, sadly. He often was commissioned to do buildings, and he never got around to finishing them. One thing he did finish was the whole new capital of the country of Bangladesh when it was set up in the 1960s, 70s, and it's an amazing building complex, as big as parts of DC. So people should look him up, Louis Kahn. I've enjoyed having a firm. If anybody's doing the math, I will be 66 in March. So I'm looking to end that. And basically, some of the people who work for me will continue taking projects. If someone calls me for a project, I'll refer it to them. And then maybe I'll help consult a little bit. But I want to get out of the hands-on daily work. I mean, the thing about architecture, practicing it is, it's a wonderful thing to do. The actual design aspect of it is great. I've been fortunate to have very good clients over the years, so I've never had a total dog of a client. Maybe once I had a dog of a client. But for the most part, they've been very good. But there's just a lot of, the work it's like anything creative. It's 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. And so it's the 90% perspiration I'm tired of. And that includes getting things approved by governing bodies, and which I appreciate, but it's still a difficult thing to do. Getting contractors who, theirs is the hardest job of all, I think, but still it's, as anyone knows who's built something, it's usually cost more than what they expected it to cost, and usually takes longer than they expected it to take. And a lot of the blame can fall on the architect when the architect isn't in control of the cost or the building. So it's things like that I don't want to have to worry about anymore. But I still like the idea of designing stuff, with a big capital D, just not constructing it. Well, the most demanding project I've done was also the biggest. It was a single family house, but it was huge. It was 24,990 square feet. The reason it was that size is it was built in Aspen, Colorado. The maximum you could build was 25,000 square feet. We just sneaked in, and it took forever to get done. It was an incredibly demanding client. It was a couple with 4 children, and it took so long that the children, who were infants when the project began, were off in college when it was done. I wouldn't say it was the most successful project by any stretch, because it just took so long and took so much out of me. The client was great in the end. I mean, the client always paid their bills and was open to looking at interesting design. It just was an exhausting process and challenging. It made subsequent projects, and I also work on projects parallel at the same time, but other smaller projects seem so much more enjoyable because they were less complex in terms of all the programmatic requirements of a really large house. Is like a small college campus. I mean, it has a lot of complexities in the mechanical systems and the plumbing systems and all that stuff. Whereas some of the smaller work, I was at a house I'm very proud of, is something I did in Connecticut a couple of years ago. We had first built a house for a family also with 4 children. And they were so happy with it that they bought the property next door and asked us to build a house for a widowed father-in-law and an older single sister-in-law. And so that was a nice challenge, to make a single house for these 2 adults who were, of course, a family, part of a family, but they also wanted separate lives in a way. And so we did a wing for the father-in-law, a wing for the sister-in-law, and then a common space that connected them, that had the living room, kitchen, dining, mudroom, entry, TV room, things like that. But that was, modest compared to the bigger house that had been built in Aspen. So it was a kind of wonderful thing to be able to do and have total control over, which we did have kind of full control over the design of that. And it was also a beautiful site. The people were very smart. Their original property was a couple of acres, but it was adjacent to an enormous land preserve, and as was the next door property. So while they only had to buy a couple of acres to build their house, they basically, their view for 100 acres was would be there in perpetuity. So we built the house, favoring the view, facing the view.
No one's ever going to build.
They could never build. It's there's a lot of land in Connecticut and in New York State increasingly that has agricultural easement on it, so that, as you know, if you own the land, you can sell the development rights to the community, but the land will always be used for farming. So the people, their great view looks across these rolling cornfields and to hills in the distance. When I come to New Albany, I walk a lot, as I mentioned, and I'm always imagining what I would do on a lot or to an existing building downtown, or to maybe if there's a building that's, not in perfect condition, how I would change it or renovate it or remodel it somehow. In fact, walking here today, I walked past the former light, gas, and water building in New Albany, which is across the street from the fire station. And I think that's the site where I would put my assisted living facility residence. Because I do think of funny little things. I think, okay, the fire trucks are across the street. So if they have to go somewhere, not that I want people to have to see that, because I don't want fires, but if the fire trucks are going somewhere, that's a bit of excitement. And so people would get to kind of watch and know what was going on. On the other hand, as we age, sometimes our hearing's not so good, so it wouldn't be a problem to be next door to the fire department. So I'm not just thinking of how, the living room connects to the dining room. I'm thinking of those sorts of things. And that's not very profound, but I think that's all those little things add up to making interesting buildings. But then the other thing I think about in New Albany, and this is being filmed in February of 2025 on a particularly cold weekend. But usually when I come here in the winter, there can be some beautiful, warmer, sunny days. And so I think, and I've mentioned this earlier with you, that houses having at least one room with a high ceiling and cross ventilation, because most of the year, the issue here is cooling, not heating, and having screens on the windows or a screen porch connected to a room so that you can open doors and have air flowing through, and your air quality in New Albany is very good compared to other places, so that's not an issue. But you do have mosquitoes and bugs, so it's just, I think the old-fashioned things like a screen porch, a way to see who's going by on the street. A lot of porches used to be on the fronts of houses. I still kind of like that as an idea. I look at the brick around here because a lot of it comes from Mississippi clay. I mean, I think it's made locally. I always think that's kind of a cool product to use in buildings. Okay, well, it's down near what we call the bypass now, but if you go down Central Avenue in New Albany all the way to where Central Avenue goes underneath 2278, it's just there on the right. I don't know what's there now, but I walked by it recently because when I take the Tanglefoot Trail, sometimes when I come back, I veer off and come up Central and not up the Tanglefoot Trail. And so it was a big metal building that had a little storefront addition to it, but the big metal building is where the lumber was stored and all the building materials, and both on the lower level and up in this loft-like area. So there were always offcuts of lumber and things that people didn't want. And there was plywood, and there was hardware and windows and things like that. And so, you know, you could cobble together lots of fun things, little projects and things there.
This is where your dad worked?
Yes.
And when did your dad pass away?
In 2010.
Okay.
So that was a business that he owned with his mother and with his sister's husband, my uncle.
And it was called?
Porter Lumber Company.
Porter Lumber
And
Company.
that had developed out of my grandmother's married name was Porter, but her maiden name was Hall. And her father had a lumber business in Union County along, you know, in the early part of the 20th century. So that lumber business, the lumber company developed out of that lumber business, was kind of an offshoot of that. I think.
Do you know where
right
that
history.
was? The Hall?
Well, that was all over the county.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's some things now called Hall Neely still. Those were my great-grandfather and old Mr. Bill Neely. They were business partners.
Okay.
A long time ago.
Are those some of your earliest memories, being in that space?
I think so, yes. Well, another influence I have to say was, now you're making me think more seriously about this. When I would go to Ackerman to visit my grandparents' Trussell, they lived on South Commerce, this nice street in downtown Ackerman, and their neighbors were a couple, the Moores. And Mr. and Mrs. Moore, Mr. Moore had a company that made cabinets and kitchen cabinets that he shipped around the country. And his childhood dream had always been to be an architect, but he didn't have the money to go to school, so he had a cabinetry shop that then he developed into a very successful business. And he and his wife were, I loved visiting my grandparents' Trussell, and then the Moores were also, they loved for me to come over and see them. And they were a very artistic couple, both of them. Like Mr. Moore made all the furniture in their house. Mrs. Moore was a potter and had wove fabric, I believe, and they had a beautiful garden in the back of their house. And I was always intrigued by the way they lived. And they lived in, I wouldn't call it a modern house, but it was a contemporary house, which didn't look like everybody else's house. And they were very interested in aesthetic things. And so they were a big influence on me too. Sam and Malvina Moore.
What was her name?
Malvina.
Okay.
She was Sam was from the Ackerman area, I think, but Malvina was from Canton, which was, you know, a much older city near Jackson. As a little child, this has nothing to do with being at the lumber company, it's being at your home, where you might take a sheet and throw it over a table and make a little fort underneath it. And I remember doing that in a very complex way, like pushing, especially my grandmother's living room, pushing tables together and chairs and having different sheets and blankets and things so that it wasn't just one space under, you know, a table. It was a whole labyrinth of little forts and tunnels and things. And I'm sure I'm imagining them being more complex than they were, but that intrigued me, those kinds of spaces, doing things like that. And I drew a lot of floor plans, and I've always been interested in the actual floor plans. When I got to school, you know, the professors would say, well, you need elevations and sections and perspectives. But I do think the plan, and many architects will say this, the plan is the generative drawing for most buildings. And so I would, you know, little line notebooks in school, spend lots of time drawing floor plans of buildings. Yeah. And this was in fourth grade, not in high school. I think all good architecture, and I hope some of mine is good, builds on other models of older architecture. I don't mean copying exactly, but learning from it. So, and as I started to say earlier, there are just so many types and building types and styles and ideas out there that it's usually easy to find a good model to use and then develop from that what you want to do for your particular client's needs and for the particular site and for their budget and et cetera, and just their wishes. But you can always start with a good influence or model. When I went to school in the late 70s and early 80s, both as an undergraduate and graduate, that was the attitude, is that for too long architecture had ignored all this rich history and it should learn from that. And so, for instance, one just example on an urban huge scale is that, 20th century America is all about the car and highways. But for the previous 20 centuries, it was more about walking and getting around. And so, these great Italian towns, they're, either Italian hill towns or small towns that have squares, and the French have place or, piazzas, were important ways for people to live together in a community. And so fast forward, that's one of the things I really like about New Albany, is it's currently really seems to be emphasizing the importance of the downtown as a magnet for people and a place to create, community. I had a professor who, in graduate school, who was obsessed with natural light. That's all he cared about, which, I agree, it's one of the most important things in buildings in the daytime. And so I'm always looking at where windows go and where skylights go. And I'll be the first to admit, if you look in books or magazines of architecture, sometimes you see these huge glass walls that may be facing south, and they look good in a photograph, but then I think, oh, it's going to be hot. You can't sit in there because of the glare. You can't see anything. You can't read. You can't watch anything. It might make a good photograph, but does it make a really good living space? And this professor's point was, you've got to think of natural light and how it enhances your living space.
Not just light for light.
Not just light for the light's sake.
Yeah.
Like a lot of times I'll have clients say they want skylights. And I'm like, well, have you lived with a skylight? Well, no, but we like the way they look. And I'll say, well, if the skylight's bringing that July and August sun down into the middle of your house where you want to be sitting at the table or in a chair or something, it's going to be the most uncomfortable place you've ever sat. And plus your air conditioning bills are going to skyrocket. So, think if it's okay to have, I've used skylights before, but I use them judiciously in a place where A, no one's going to be actually parked sitting, and B, where they're not going to be, maybe they're northern facing skylights, so they're not taking such hot, intolerable sun. I think it's very important when people design a building, or when people commission an architect to design a building, that architect thinks about how the windows and the building is oriented on the site, because I don't think it's as simple as just taking any plan you get in a book or you buy somewhere and just plopping it down on a piece of land. You really do need to consider, generally it's considered, to have south-facing windows, but have them protected with some sort of overhang so you don't burn. You can have north-facing windows, but make sure they're like really good IGUs, and maybe they're not quite as big because of the cold coming from the north. On the other hand, and I've used large north-facing windows, they do give beautiful light without bleaching the furniture and bleaching the art and baking the occupants.